Hey, a quick message before we get started. I know that you hear me mention on the show regularly what it means to be a subscriber of the Washington Post. It's about being informed about the people and events shaping the world around you. It's about supporting the journalism that you hear on this podcast every day. And it's about sending a message that the work you encounter here is something that you value. And right now, it is even more affordable to become a Washington Post subscriber. We've got a new subscription deal going. You can get 4 weeks of the Washington Post for just 99 cents. And that is a rate that you can lock in for a full year. All of the Washington Post's amazing journalism for just 99 cents every 4 weeks. If you've heard me talk about subscriptions before, if you've thought about becoming a part of our community of subscribers, now is the moment. This deal expires June 3rd. So take a second and go to the subscription link in our show notes or to washingtonpost.com/subscribe. Again, that is washingtonpost.com/subscribe. We are so excited to welcome you as a subscriber. And thank you so much. Now, here's today's show. Earlier this month, there was a Republican women's lunch in the city of Coeur d'Alene in North Idaho. During an election year in a state that is very red, this is not an unusual scene. But something about this lunch was unusual. The conversations happening between bites of food and the speakers who were at the microphone, they are part of an uprising.
Well, welcome, everyone. We're glad to see all of you. This is very exciting. And as you know, we have a little less than 3 weeks to go. And it's going to take all of us. And I see one of the things I think that's really exciting is to see our numbers grow across the communities.
The women in this room with their nice outfits on and their salads and their iced tea, they don't look like rebels, but that's what they are. This is essentially a rebel force in North Idaho that is trying to reclaim the Republican Party from leaders they think have taken it too far right.
Hannah Alam covers extremism and domestic terrorism for The Post. She spent time in North Idaho earlier this month with audio producer Rennie Svirnovsky.
These women are self-proclaimed traditional Republicans, essentially establishment Republicans. These are women who've served on school boards and city councils and in various aspects as part of their civic life.
These self-proclaimed traditional Republicans became rebels because they say their local party has been taken over by people with extremist far-right views. So before the primary election that just happened on Tuesday, several of them, along with many men in the community, went from concerned citizens to candidates. They wanted to take on those other Republicans and to make sure that there was no chance that history could repeat itself in North Idaho.
Many women in the room remember from a generation ago when the Aryan nations and other white supremacist militants moved to the area, set it up as this sanctuary for hate groups. Many, many militants, white supremacists, came from all over the country, and North Idaho became a hub for these groups. Even back then, it wasn't many or most of North Idahoans participating in this, but the presence and the violence that came from the compound that was there for decades was such a stain on the community's national image. And a lot of women in this room are exactly the civic leaders who worked so hard to change that image and create a different vision of North Idaho.
Really, if you think about it, there's over 150 people running for precinct committeemen in Kootenai County. We have never seen anything like this. And I think it is a movement. It has been an awakening for us.
So if you are running for a precinct, raise your hand just so everybody can see.
Brava.
All right.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, May 22nd. Results have come in from Tuesday's primary in Idaho. Former President Donald Trump picked up another 34 delegates as the presumptive Republican presidential nominee. In the races for statewide offices, Tuesday was also a clear win for ultra-conservative Republican candidates. But Hannah has been focused on the outcomes of several hyper-local primary races. They were for precinct committee seats. People have described those races to her as, quote, a vote for the soul of the local Republican Party. And that's the story that Hannah is going to share today. The story of how the hard right took control of the Republican Party in North Idaho, and the extraordinary steps that these self-described traditional Republicans took to try and regain control. So, Hannah, can you go back and explain how exactly was it that this group of traditional or more moderate Republicans ended up losing control in North Idaho?
A lot of it mirrors what happened in the country more broadly with the advent of the Tea Party and later Trumpism and the rise of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and essentially this rightward lurch of the party as it adopted more and more hardline stances, as people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others were elected to Congress, people with very extreme views, people who weren't in political life before. All of that is mirrored in North Idaho. And the self-proclaimed traditional Republicans, the establishment folks that we talked to, said, it's fine. This is North Idaho. We're tolerant of all kinds of different views. They just considered them fringe, these fringe actors. They'd show up to council meetings. They would maybe launch these long shot bids for office. But they said they didn't really recognize or appreciate the threat they were up against until 2022, when across Idaho, there was a sweep of candidates who adhere to this harder line conservatism.
And what kinds of positions have the hardliners taken over?
So institution by institution, we saw these hard right candidates ascend to power, whether it's school board posts, council positions, the library board, university, and most importantly, in terms of building party power, at the level of these precinct committee seats.
And what are precinct committee seats?
Well, that's the thing. Nobody knows. And so that was really where they had to start. Precinct committee seats, these are, the small building blocks, these seats that will decide the kind of tenor and agenda of local Republican parties. Then they go on to the state and they send delegates to the state. And then that shapes the entire Republican Party. That leads to real power when it comes to those state offices and policies that can shape the future of Idaho.
And why were some of these candidates winning? Why were their platforms so appealing to people?
Well, first of all, North Idaho is a conservative place. And so those messages do have resonance with people. Also, there's been a large contingent of people who've moved into the area recently, people who have a harder right conservative agenda than was there before, people who were attracted to North Idaho because they thought that this was a place where they could feel at home, a degree of racial and religious homogeneity there. And so some of the more moderate factions say some of the stuff is imported from outside. It was also kind of a slow burn, though. It was a kind of a slow buildup. People heard the rhetoric getting harsher and harsher, the extremism creeping into some of the words and eventually some policies. And by the time they looked up, all of these kind of levers of power had been claimed by this group that had moved in, organized, mobilized, and had kind of built their power from the grassroots up.
And so when these establishment Republicans talk about the people that have taken over the official party in North Idaho, who are they talking about?
One key face of this movement in North Idaho is a man named Brent Regan. He is the current chairman of the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee. That's a mouthful, but it's basically just the local Republican committee. And it's based there in Coeur d'Alene, covers the whole county. So he's chairman of that. He's also chairman of the board of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. That is this conservative lobby group that has become extremely influential in Idaho politics through its system of rating and vetting candidates, rewarding those who will vote along with the hardline agenda.
What is that agenda all about? What makes them so problematic to the more moderate Republicans?
Overall, I think the more moderate Republicans saw this group as wanting to gut public schools, wanting to infuse Christianity, and especially a conservative brand of Christianity, into education. They wanted to police what was in the libraries in a way that made, some other Republicans uncomfortable, especially those who say, we're constitutionalists up here in North Idaho. What about the First Amendment? So there were all these divisions on policy, but I guess the actual policies are not that far apart. There's not that much daylight. These are conservative folks who support a conservative agenda, but some of the rhetoric and associations that have come in under the leadership of Regan is what they're concerned about. Probably the biggest example of the concern, of the far-right concern, is the committee's associations and Brent Regan's associations in particular with Dave Riley. He is one of the most controversial figures on the Idaho political scene. He's a guy extremism monitors have called a far-right propagandist. He's promoted Holocaust revisionist language on his now deleted social media posts. He's called Judaism the religion of the Antichrist, and he attended the Unite the Right march in Charlottesville, that 2017 march that was kind of a wake-up call to the country about this resurgent far-right threat. So in the aftermath of Charlottesville, Dave Riley moves to North Idaho, and he sets up shop there, becomes involved in local politics, and he runs for a school board seat in North Idaho. And he received the endorsement of the Republican committee. And Regan himself donated to that campaign. And more recently, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, again, where Regan is the chairman of the board, this group hires Dave Riley for some contract communications work. That came to light just this past year.
And just for the record, were you able to talk to either of these individuals, Dave Riley or Brent Regan?
So I reached out to both of them. Dave Riley, I didn't get a response from. Over the years, I will say that he has rejected those labels of anti-Semite or white supremacist. He was asked in 2021 about those views, and he told a local outlet that he was under attack by what he called radical left-wing activists. And in that same story, he also compared his troubles to the persecution of Jesus. Brent Regan answered my questions by email. Both of them over the years have been defensive, to these accusations of racism, extremism. They've rejected the idea that this hardline faction is extremist. They say we're just simply representing the sensibilities of North Idaho. I asked Brent Regan, given Dave Riley's presence in Charlottesville and this trove of now deleted tweets where he's saying hate speech, on what basis did the committee endorse him? And on what basis did you donate to his campaign? And he said that the committee was not aware of those negative Twitter posts at the time. He said Riley has apologized for the statement and that the local GOP has added professional background checks to the vetting process. And he said that the committee has also passed resolutions denouncing all forms of extremism. But he didn't disavow Dave Riley. He said, I have never defended Mr. Riley's words, but like Elon Musk, I have defended people's right to free speech and for due process. And so he's saying, I don't agree with the content of those posts, but people have the right to free speech and for due process. And his opponents would say, that's great. We all support free speech and due process, but we don't want someone who is at Charlottesville and on our school board. Or we don't want someone with his history of tweets creating communication strategy for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which is very influential in rating and vetting candidates and playing a gatekeeping role.
So, Hannah, I want to dig into some of the ways that people's lives have changed in North Idaho since 2022, when the far right started to really consolidate power there. What did the voters that you spoke with say about what they've seen and how they feel?
Yeah, so earlier this month, I visited Sandpoint, Idaho. That is this town in the far north part of the state. And there was a candidate forum at a local high school, and dozens of people showed up on a Tuesday night to hear all these people who are going to be on the ballot Tuesday.
Without further ado, we're just going to get started.
I was sitting at the back next to a woman named Lynn Frank.
You've lived here almost 48 years.
She's a 76-year-old retiree. I asked her why she had come.
What brings you here tonight? Why did you think it was important to show up?
There are a couple of people running that I totally disagree with, and so...
Lynn is a longtime resident of nearby Sagal, and she told me she's been watching these far-right forces creep into local politics in a way that's made her concerned over the years.
It's so different. It's being taken over by out-of-state groups.
She thinks that a lot of these ideologies come with the newcomers who have come to North Idaho looking for an ultra-conservative utopia.
And those of us that have lived here and wanted it just simple and nice, it's just being overtaken by some of these other very demanding people. And one of the guys running tonight, our state senator, is responsible for my not having a gynecologist.
So as she was saying that, Lynn kind of gestured over at one of the candidates on stage, a guy named Scott Herndon. He's the incumbent state senator from Idaho's 1st District, and he was running for another term. Lynn says that Herndon is responsible because he is one of the loudest voices against abortion in Idaho and one of the most conservative proponents of abortion bans. Idaho has one of the strictest abortion bans in the country. And that's led to a drain of doctors and medical workers who are fearful of running afoul of these laws and ending up fined or jailed because they've given care that would be considered a standard of care anywhere else. So she sees him as the kind of person whose policies and rhetoric are scaring away medical providers, including her own doctor, someone she was planning to see in August for a checkup and now will not be able to.
I was seeing a gynecologist for a precancerous condition. I have to go find somebody.
And you'll have to go to a different town.
I'll either have to go to Coeur d'Alene or I'll have to go all the way to Spokane.
Herndon's positions have made him a controversial figure in North Idaho, but some of the things he said in the abortion debate have made national headlines and drawn national outrage. Perhaps his most incendiary comment came last year during an exchange with a Democratic legislator where they were talking about abortion and hypothetical scenarios. And his colleague said, well, what about a scenario in which a 13-year-old girl is raped by a relative? And Herndon said,
some people could describe the situation that you're talking about as the opportunity to have a child in those terrible circumstances if the rape actually occurred.
He mentions reading about a mother in Montana who had found it, quote, incredibly cathartic, end quote, to carry her rapist baby to term. These were remarks that were deemed outrageous nationally by reproductive rights groups, but they also made some local women, conservative women, uncomfortable.
And did you talk to Herndon at all?
I did. After the candidate forum, we chatted for about half an hour, and I asked him about those remarks. And he said while they were taken totally out of context, that he stood by the stances. He said, no, if you're raped, I don't think you should kill your baby. That's how he put it.
It's just fake news. I mean, frankly, as Trump says, it's fake news. She said, you're going to make her tortured and to carry the baby. And I said, I know people who have been raped, who have had a baby, who will tell you that it's been a blessing in their life. And that's what I said.
I also asked him more broadly about the concerns that his politics are too far right. a few years ago, somebody like you with your platform would be considered a fringe, would be considered
I
radical.
wouldn't say so, because I would say no, because I'm actually, if you look at my actual votes in politics, I'm actually a very traditional conservative. And I'm really just more of a Reagan-type Republican who's actually a fiscal conservative and is actually a traditional family and traditional children, protect the children and protect the family conservative.
So you've talked about some of the ways in which access to abortion and reproductive health issues are at the center of some of the concerns that people have about the hardline conservatives who've taken control in Idaho. But what are some of the other issues that have been affected by the people who are now in power?
So again, this is a place, where everyone pretty much is Republican, and they espouse this conservative brand of republicanism, and that's just sort of how it's been. But then with the ascent of the hardline right, we're suddenly seeing in North Idaho the same culture war fights that we've seen in other places over schools, public education versus sort of homeschooling and Christian or faith-based education, libraries and book banning attempts, and this sort of right-wing campaign to rid libraries of anything they see as offensive, which extremism experts will tell you really means anything to do with race, racism, the legacy of racism, women's rights, LGBTQ communities, etc. We have seen those library campaigns play out in really ugly ways in North Idaho. One of the people I've been speaking with for a year there and finally got to meet in person on this trip is a woman named Kimber Glidden.
I love my little 1 acre piece of property here, right? I mean, I have these beautiful trees and I have my little farm.
Kimber had been an administrator at the library in Sandpoint, but in 2022, she saw a job posting. It was for a vacancy a little farther north in a town called Bonners Ferry.
The library director job here was open, so I applied for it. And I got it. And I was so excited because it's like, okay, next step in my career. I've already been interim director. Now I get to be a director. I get to live in my community. I get to to meet people and become involved in this community. And Hannah, I thought all my dreams have come true. I have my little country house, even though it was, in need of a remodel, but it was like, we had like all of this stuff.
And that dream pretty much fizzled very early on because she had book ban challenges. And she said, we don't even have these titles that people were complaining about in the library.
Within 2 months, it all came unraveled. And I had no idea. It felt surreal, especially when the first time I got attacked. It didn't matter that I told these people, we don't even have these books.
What were the books that people didn't want?
The specific one in her case was one that many librarians across the country have faced problems with, which is the book Genderqueer. This is a book that's it wasn't even in their collection. But Kimber said, no, if a patron asks for it, I'm going to do everything I can to get it because that's also the First Amendment. They have First Amendment rights. And she believed strongly that that was her duty as a librarian to provide people with materials should they request them.
And then it all just went south from there when I was like, I'm not going to infringe on your child's First Amendment rights. I'm sorry, that is illegal. I cannot do that.
She faced so much ugliness, harassment, doxing, name-calling.
We had the most violent start to where, we had the huge protests and the people showing up, with guns.
She would describe scenes of being at these library board meetings where there's a line of armed men watching it from the back of the room, listening to her. She talked about going to get pizza with her family and being confronted in public. She describes basically an intimidation campaign that was, as she saw it, designed to force her out of her position. And in her case, it worked. By that August 2022, she'd resigned.
So one time, I asked my dad, I said, when do I quit? When is enough? And he said to me, he goes, you can't quit. He says, it's too important. And I quit. And I just feel like I haven't done enough with this. But when I don't have the help and I don't have a community, I can't take on the entire far right of the United States.
Wow. And she connects that back to who's in charge of some of these like local positions.
Yes, I mean, she says this is what happens when you embolden this hard right. And we should keep in mind that Idaho is a testing ground, and traditionally has been, for some of these policies that then get replicated and tried out in other parts of the country.
Nobody pays attention to Idaho, but it's a great place to start setting legal precedents. Oh, it worked here, this is how we do it. Oh, that didn't work, and you start to rework it so they can use it as a testing ground because nobody pays attention to Idaho. Or it's easy to disregard. Oh, that's just a bunch of loonies in Idaho.
So, Hannah, the issues that you're describing playing out in this part of North Idaho sound a lot like issues that we have seen play out in places around the country, right? Like arguments over abortion restrictions and book bans and fights over education policy. But I wonder why all of this has become even more tense in this part of Idaho. Like, why is the potential for extremism something that people here are particularly worried about?
I think it all goes back to geography and history. This is this stunningly beautiful place up near the Canadian border, gorgeous mountain vistas, these shimmering lakes, and it's really beautiful. The geography there, this rugged terrain and isolation, has been attractive for many years to homesteaders who just want to come and live off the land, libertarians, religious movements, free thinkers of all sorts, sort of anybody who wanted to just be left alone. And that has included far-right extremist movements, too. That history has played out. There's, most famously with the Aryan nations and other militant groups that kind of settled there in the mid-'70s and operated out of there all the way up till 2000.
This emblem up here is a symbol of the Aryan nations.
That voice you're hearing is Richard Butler. He is dead now, but he was the former leader of the white supremacist group, the Aryan Nations. Butler actually built a compound on the edge of Coeur d'Alene back in the 1970s, this 20-acre property with a church on it. People, white supremacists would come from all over the country. He would have youth nights where they listened to white supremacist bands and music and met. So it really became a central hub of the white power movement in the United States, and it maintained a presence there for decades, from the mid-1970s all the way until 2000, when it collapsed under legal challenges and infighting. One of the most vivid memories for people in North Idaho of that era are the neo-Nazi marches that the Aryan nations would have through downtown Coeur d'Alene.
Those kind of visuals were just ugly. It felt surreal.
That's Christy Wood, a Coeur d'Alene city councilwoman. Back in the days of the Aryan nations, she worked as a police officer, and she was assigned to some of these marches for crowd control and to keep the peace.
The hate, you don't see it 24/7, and then it shows up in mass with all of their garb and their chants, and of course there were demonstrations and counter demonstrations, and they would come into the heart of Coeur d'Alene to do this nonsense, and it felt just disgusting.
Christy Wood is part of a task force, an anti-hate task force that formed in this era and became really active. And it was the same task force that when the Aryan nations and other militant spin-off groups started waging campaigns that went beyond just the hateful parades. We're talking assassination attempts and pipe bombs going off and all of this more violent targeting of their opponents, civil rights leaders, anyone locally who they saw as standing in their way. So by the late 90s, the Aryan nations had been weakened by infighting. It had been under scrutiny by federal authorities for a long time. The FBI had been looking into spinoff groups, acolytes of Butler's who went on to wage terror campaigns with the stated goal of triggering a race war. And the beginning of the end for the Aryan nations came with this violent incident in 1998 where a mother and her son who were driving by the compound outside of Coeur d'Alene came under fire and were harassed, roughed up, terrorized, essentially, by guards from the compound. And this spirals into a landmark legal challenge in which local activists, backed by national civil rights attorneys, were able to bankrupt the Aryan nations in court. And by 2001, the group was forced to close its compound and leave. And this is seen in the community as a triumph. This was a victory against hate. They were proud to have risen up against this and to have been seen by the entire nation as taking a stand against this pernicious threat that had, been in their community for so many years.
The people that surround Kootenai County at the time, that lived in Kootenai County at the time, were very much like the people that were on the jury that convicted them. They did not want that presence here. They did not want to be known for the Aryan nations being in our area. And that's why... Sure, yeah, there's some fear involved. And that's why the task force had so much support. It was like somebody's going to stick their necks out, and they were threatened, their lives were threatened, and they helped the community find a way to deal with this and manage it and push back.
The Aryan nations was defiant to the end. Even after they lost their property and then they lost this lawsuit and they're facing bankruptcy, one of the last sort of big public statements that Richard Butler said, he said, "It's okay, this is nothing.
We have planted seeds. Most of North Idaho now is filled with the people who escaped multiculturalism or diversity."
Now when you hear people in North Idaho talk, they say, maybe we didn't listen closely enough to what he was saying. What were those seeds? How are they sprouting today? What are we seeing? People are going back to those days and thinking hard about what it means to eradicate hate. The compound's gone. It's a big empty field now. But what were those seeds that Butler was talking about? And what do they look like today?
It's different, but it's still hate. That kind of visual eventually went away, but it's been replaced with something just as sinister.
So, Hannah, it sounds like a lot of the people who live here, like Christy, that they see this connection between the white nationalism in North Idaho's past and the kind of hardline conservatives that have taken over local control of the Republican Party more recently. I'm curious what you make of that connection, or do you see it as so straightforward that, like, what's happening now is an echo of what was happening in North Idaho in the 70s and 80s and 90s?
So we should be clear. These are not the same people, and it's not the same threat. And back then, people said you knew who the extremists were and where they were. These were the guys wearing Nazi garb at their hideouts in the woods. But these days, Republican organizers told us they are up against a much more sophisticated brand of extremists. Former Lieutenant Governor of Idaho, Jack Riggs, called it Aryan 2.0. It's this idea that it's the same old bigotry, but this time with newfound political cover that has come in recent years. So, for example, today, politicians there will tell you, we're against any supremacy of any kind, but then they'll talk about immigration and crime and social issues, LGBTQ issues, and you can just hear this coded language and dog whistle throughout those messages. And these are folks who hold a great deal of power in the state through party committees and elected positions, school boards, library boards, and so on. So today's far-right figures aren't saying we want an ethno-state like the Aryan nations were saying. But they do promote this idea of North Idaho as a racially, religiously homogenous place that is a bastion for traditional families. And they talk about family life and heritage and all of this language that extremism researchers will tell you is code for those same kinds of ideologies that have been promoted there for decades.
After the break, how the self-described traditional Republicans tried to wrestle back control of their party. We'll be right back. So, Hannah, at the beginning of the episode, you retraced for me the history of the Republican Party in North Idaho and the split that has developed in this very interesting way. So I want to talk now about these establishment Republicans who say that they're trying to take back control of their party. Who is organizing that, and who is a part of this effort?
They come from a cross-section of Republican life in North Idaho. Former elected officials, business leaders, people with long civic and community ties in North Idaho. Some of them peeled off from the party over lack of transparency. Others said they didn't like the stifling of debate and the promotion of only one kind of republicanism. Others said, again, these concerns over extremism and the creep of rhetoric they think has no business in the party.
They want to take us back to some sort of archaic medieval time. There is open conversation about rolling back the rights of women.
One of the main architects of this mobilization, Krista Hazel, she described the coming together of all these different forces as the Avengers assembling.
This is like Avengers. We all have our different origin stories, but we've all come together. And Brent Reagan is Thanos. Like, that's it.
The mobilization began in earnest after that sweep of the hard right in 2022. And that created this class of disaffected, sidelined Republicans who kind of all found each other, were complaining to one another, shared these concerns, and eventually decided that they're going to mobilize against the committee.
We just started talking and saying, what we see, we do not believe is right. It's not Republican.
Another main organizer of this push has been former Lieutenant Governor Jack Riggs. And he's married to Sandy Patano, herself a prominent Republican organizer. The two of them are among the founding members of this coalition they're calling North Idaho Republicans. And that has really been the engine behind this mobilization.
And we invited some others at that time 2 years ago, other people that we knew that had not been former elected officials, to ask if they wanted to be involved and publicly involved with their names and faces, basically not exposed, but in a very public nature.
And for the people who are trying to wrestle back some control of the Republican Party in Idaho, what are they trying to achieve? Like, what do they think they'll be able to accomplish by winning back some of these seats?
I think they have some short-term goals, such as keeping and recruiting medical providers who will come and work in this region of Idaho. But I think the bigger goals are really about community and these competing visions for North Idaho. And what kind of place will this be? 25 years after they have pushed out a hate group, I think they'd like to see a political climate where dissent is encouraged and accepted, where different kinds of viewpoints are tolerated, where far-right extremism and rhetoric is deemed disqualifying or shouldn't belong in public office, where there's a clear line between the kinds of behavior and conduct that is acceptable and the kind that is unacceptable. And to them, this is bigger than this one race. They're saying this is about community and this is about the kind of North Idaho we'd like to see. Or at least that's how Sandy Patano puts it. She's Jack Riggs' wife and herself an active political voice in Coeur d'Alene.
Our families live here. We're really fortunate. We want them to remain here. We want our grandkids to grow up here. And we found that in a lot of other people too. This is a great place. It is worth fighting for. And it doesn't have to be duking it out, and it doesn't have to be with bullets. It can be with ballots.
And how are people like Jack Riggs and Sandy Patano trying to accomplish their goal of taking back control?
Well, they're speaking out against it. They're organizing against it. They're kind of borrowing from the hardliners' playbook by going after the very grassroots building blocks of the party, by fielding candidates for precinct committee seats. That was a vehicle for the hardline power. And now the more moderate faction is saying, okay, we're going to do the same. They're also running radio ads like this one, laying out exactly how they see the stakes and what might happen if the hard right faction maintains control.
The KCRCC has been a breeding ground for extremism in North Idaho, bringing chaos and disgrace to our community. From attacks on teachers, librarians, and healthcare workers to a failed property tax assessor, the services we depend on are now at risk.
And for all of the excitement and energy around this movement, they told us this has been an enormous undertaking that involved reaching out to all their contacts, reviving old ties, recruiting new people, and just really calling on everyone with a stake in the future of North Idaho to join them.
Mark them as not home. There's so many to cover that we'll just leave them the literature and move on.
We actually went out door knocking with one of these candidates that's been backed by the North Idaho Republicans. That's that group that Sandy Patano and Jack Riggs are involved in. This candidate's name was Russell Mann, and he was running for one of those local precinct committee seats.
Gonna do whatever it takes. I heard dogs, but I don't think they're... Oh! Ah! Hi, Gerald. How's it going? Good. My name's Russell Mann. I'm your neighbor here.
Right.
I'm running for precinct committeeman. Right. On the ballot.
Russell Mann's a really fascinating figure. Here's someone who grew up in North Idaho.
Rathdrum, Idaho. Born and raised in Rathdrum, Idaho. Grew up in rural poverty, which I didn't know that I was in poverty when I was a kid, but I do remember standing in the government cheese line at the Quonset hut in town.
In many ways, he said, his life since childhood has been intertwined with these extremist elements that have found a home in North Idaho. He grew up very close to the Aryan Nations compound.
We would get in the mail their propaganda. Even as a teenager, I'm reading this stuff going, oh my God, this is crazy.
He said as a kid, they used to have sleepovers and kind of dare each other to go, closer to the compound and kind of peek in. And the role Russell Mann is playing right now is what these Republicans pushing against extremism consider sort of their secret weapon.
I did some of these houses already, so we're going to let them start anyway.
He was eager to go and have these hard conversations face to face. He was ready for it. He had his talking points.
And what kind of reception was he getting from people? Like, how much were folks like, yeah, you have a good point?
Some people were gruff. Some people were welcoming. And then we got to the home of this priest, Thomas Hall, and his wife, Dixie, answered the door.
Let that puppy out. Hi, my name's Russell. I'm running for precinct committeeman here.
Okay.
And are you Dixie?
I am.
Awesome. And Dixie and Thomas live here.
Yes.
And registered Republicans.
Yes.
And it says
They talked for a while. They talked about the church. They talked about, their sort of conservative credentials. And yes, we're both sort of traditional on this and that. And
so we're going to be a bit more conservative.
Okay.
More traditional in human sexuality and those issues.
Okay, very cool. That sounds really neat. I love it.
But then he kind of opened this conversation, took it a little bit further and said something like, with them, he made this pitch that, churches are supposed to be a place of worship, not a place where you go in and you see a big American flag or it's really overtly political. And so they talked about that.
And just, because you have people in your congregation that are on lots of sides of the issue. And
from that point of view, I don't know, have you seen how some of the churches have gotten politically aligned here? And it sounds like you're not in favor of that. I'm also not in favor of that. I think that, and I know those pastors that are doing that.
Good hearts.
I've known them for 25 years, and I'm just so disappointed that they've taken that path.
Yeah.
So.
I think as my husband is...
Dixie warmed up to Russell. She eventually invited him in, and so we all go in and sit in the Hall family's living room. And that's where Russell made his pitch.
I feel like the acrimonious tactics, are not good for us. It's, in general, it's an extremism that's going on. I'm coming from the side of, I just want to raise my family and build my business. As long as as long as things are going moderately well, I don't want to get involved. But with the extremism that's going on now, I'm stepping up to try to rein that back. So continue to be conservative, but not extreme.
Good.
So
good.
That's where I'm coming from.
Okay.
Thomas Hall listened. He nodded along. He heard Russell's pitch about this extremism taking over, and he said,
"Well, I don't play my cards because I'm a priest, but
That's smart.
we certainly want a solid, responsible citizenry."
At the end, Thomas Hall wouldn't say which way he's going to vote or whether Russell had his support, but he and Dixie offered to pray for him.
Yeah, we can pray. That's okay, right? With you all?
I'm happy with that.
Are you good with that? Okay.
All right, this is Russell, right?
Yep.
Russell.
Man.
All right. Great God, we thank you for your work in this country through so many avenues. We pray for Russell, every effort, Lord, because he believes firmly and strongly enough to even want to serve in government. So we ask your blessing on his campaign, that he'll get his ideas across, and that he will, if elected, will just wonderfully represent our precinct. We ask your blessing on all of our lives beyond our businesses. In your name, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
So, Hannah, now it's the day after the primary in Idaho. We talked a little bit about the results of that election at the top of the show, but I want to hear in more detail what actually happened in this county that you were looking at, and what were the results there?
Well, the challengers didn't get the route they were hoping for. They had wanted this symbolic vote that was this kind of full-throated rejection of the extremism that they'd been raising awareness about. They didn't get that. They picked up 30 seats. They needed 37 out of 73 to be able to get the majority needed to really change things on the local committee to oust Brent Regan and to remake the party. That didn't happen. They were celebrating a win farther north of Coeur d'Alene, up in that legislative District 1, where Scott Herndon, the self-proclaimed abortion abolitionist, narrowly lost to his challenger, a self-described traditional conservative named Jim Woodward. That was a very expensive and hard-fought race. But, there was also disappointment. We spoke to Russell Mann, that precinct committee candidate who was out door knocking. He ended up losing. He said he was going out in the rain today to pick up his signs. But he also said that those 30 seats are just the beginning. And he wrote to me in a text message, "While I'm disappointed to not be among them, I'm rooting for the winning challengers to be able to make a positive difference." And so, there's disappointment among the challengers, but also a recognition that those wins that they did get, they're interpreting that as an indication that their message does have resonance and that they're not alone in their concerns about the extremism that they're raising awareness about.
And for the people who won in this primary, the hardliners, what did they have to say about this victory and what it meant to them?
Well, they were gloating. Brent Regan almost immediately went on X, formerly Twitter, and posts a note that says, "The predictions of my demise were greatly exaggerated." So it was his way of kind of pushing back against all these people who were saying, your days are numbered. We're coming for you, Brent Regan. We're going to show you the true nature of Idaho conservatism. He was able to say, nope, I still won. I still hold sway here. And, I will say he acknowledged to local news reporters that it was a tough fight and that his side had lost some longtime precinct committee members. So he acknowledged that it wasn't a cakewalk for them. And so I think in the end, that's kind of what, one of the goals that these challengers had was to remind the local Republican leadership that not everyone in the county or in North Idaho was on board with this increasingly hard right agenda.
So thinking about the story that you've just shared and the kind of mixed results from what we saw in the primary, what do you think listeners should make of that? Like, what does it say about the state of the Republican Party?
Well, from the very beginning, these challengers were upfront about the task that lay ahead of them, that it was going to be a tough fight and that they might not win. I think after spending a week with them, talking to them and observing this mobilization from the ground, I really do think that part of what they had hoped to accomplish was to activate maybe this electorate that had taken politics for granted, had kind of gone along, and suddenly had woken up to this idea that this hard right faction was now very active and causing friction in the schools and the medical field and the libraries. And they would say the awareness and this mobilization, that's all a win against apathy and against taking these politics for granted, especially taking these tiny, unglamorous seats at the precinct committee level for granted, and reminding people that even at that hyper-local grassroots level, those seats matter.
Hannah Alam covers extremism and domestic terrorism for The Post. Additional reporting came from Rennie Svirnovsky, producer for Post Reports. Archival tape in this story is from The Color of Conscience, a documentary produced by Marsha Franklin of Idaho Public Television about the human rights activists in Idaho who fought against the Aryan Nations. Before we wrap, some news from another one of Tuesday's primaries. In Georgia, Fani Willis has won her primary in her quest to be reelected district attorney of Fulton County. Listeners who've been following the criminal trials against Trump will know that Willis has been leading the prosecution of Trump in the state for alleged election crimes. But her role in that case has faced intense scrutiny because of her romantic relationship with another prosecutor. And it remains a legal question whether she'll be able to stay involved in the Trump case going forward. Even so, Willis's re-election campaign will move ahead to the November general election. And in other news, a major announcement from Europe.
Today, Ireland, Norway, and Spain are announcing that we recognize the state of Palestine.
The Irish, Norwegian, and Spanish governments are all declaring that they will officially recognize Palestinian statehood, a symbolic step that the Irish Prime Minister predicted might encourage other nations to take similar actions.
And I'm confident that further countries will join us in taking this important step in the coming weeks.
The Israeli government continues to reject the two-state solution, and we're outraged at the announcement from these European leaders. On Wednesday, Israel ordered the return of its ambassadors from Ireland, Norway, and Spain. That's it for today's episode of Post Reports. Thank you so much for listening. And just a reminder, now is the time to take advantage of that amazing Washington Post subscription deal that I mentioned at the top of the show. It's 99 cents for every 4 weeks. Subscribe now to lock in that rate for a full year. Go to washingtonpost.com/subscribe. And there's a link in the show notes wherever you're listening. Thank you again so much. Today's episode was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky. It was edited by Renita Jablonski and Ted Muldoon, who also mixed the show today. Thank you so much to Griff Woody. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.